Today, we're going to be discussing how to master 3-betting. We're going to be looking through a bunch of spots and looking for general patterns, overall patterns that you can use to use a good, strong 3-betting strategy that is both effective and implementable. If you want to go ahead and test yourself, if you think you're already 3-betting master, head over to pokercoaching.com/3betquiz and test yourself. Louis Philippe, who runs our poker coaching study session, says right here in the chat, an amazing tip. One of the best tips he got from poker coaching coach Matt Affleck, who says you should 3-bet bluff hands that are 1 pip below your opponent's opening range. So, if your opponent is opening, let's say 10x offsuit, your 3-bet should often come from hands like 9x offsuit. We'll see if that pattern holds true. I think you're usually going to find that it does, especially from the later positions. Let's take a look at this. Let's say under the gun is opening with this range, okay? This is where the pattern's not necessarily going to hold true because the opponent's range is very strong to begin with. By the way, we are looking at 80 big blinds deep when under the gun raises in a tournament, okay? 8-handed poker tournament. All right? In this scenario, when you're under the gun +1, also very early position versus a raise, you're going to be 3-betting really tightly. Really tightly. And the reason we're going to be 3-betting really tightly here is because the opponent's range is really tight. So in this scenario, you can see, by the way, if you cannot see, it means you're listening to this, you probably want to watch this at youtube.com/pokercoaching. Shout out to everybody listening on all the podcast apps though. So in this spot, you're 3-betting just your absolute best hands. Something like queens and better, maybe jacks and better, and then ace-king. Ace-queen offsuit as a bluff, by the way. We can tell this is a bluff because we can go up here in the poker coaching preflop charts, click versus 4-bet from under the gun, and you'll see we fold ace-queen offsuit if they 4-bet us, right? So essentially, take a look at this chart here. This is an important chart. All these hands in this range are 3-bet some portion of the time. Obviously, these hands down here are 3-bet infrequently, right? So when you 3-bet these hands and get 4-bet, you're supposed to fold the hands that are now in blue, which includes pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket 7s. Feels pretty dirty to 3-bet these hands and then fold to a 4-bet. But that's what you have to do if your opponent's actually raising a very tight range. Also, king-queen suited, king-jack suited, king-10 suited, all fold. You get it in with kings, queens, and ace-king. You slow play aces, call ace-queen, kings, ace-queen suited, ace-jack suited, ace-10 suited, queens, jacks. 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited because they're super live, and pocket 6s randomly. Sure. You're going to find a lot of the hands at the bottom of the continuing range are close to break even. All these hands with mixed frequencies are close to break even. So it doesn't really matter so much what you do in those scenarios. But take a look at this. Versus raise, you're going to see most of your 3-bets are going to come from your best hands and then hands that are not quite good enough to call. Is the volume low, or is it just you? Volume looks okay to me. Let's see. If there's ever a problem, let me know. I think the volume's okay. Test, hello. I don't know. Turn it up on your end. How about that? Turn it up on your end. That's usually the answer. Okay. So anyway, as you see, we're 3-betting the best hands. Ace-queen offsuit as a bluff. Some king-x suited and ace-x suited as bluffs. And then calling the hands that don't really want to 3-bet and have to face a 4-bet. That's going to be hands like ace-queen suited, ace-jack suited, ace-10 suited, king-queen suited, king-jack suited, queen-jack suited, middle pairs. Okay? These are the hands that usually want to call. Okay, so that's what you do against an early position raiser. All right? What do we do against a... What do we do if we're in later position? So now if instead of being under the gun +1 ourselves, what if we are now in the hijack seat? Well, now we're going to call substantially wider, right? We're going to call substantially wider in this instance because now we are closing or closer to closing the action, right? So in this scenario, as you see, we now 3-bet roughly the same range for value. Aces, kings, queens, some jacks, and ace-king. Aces, kings, queens, ace-king. But now instead of 3-bet bluffing with hands like ace-queen offsuit so much, and king-queen suited, and ace-jack suited, and queen-jack suited, like all these medium-ish hands, we're now calling all these medium hands. A lot of good suited connectors call, like good suited Broadway hands. Ace-queen very often calls, and then low and medium pairs are going to do a whole lot of calling because they really want to see the flop, and they really want to try to flop a set. By the way, if I scroll down, 3s and 2s also call the majority of the time. I know that's slightly off your screen. Want to make sure you can kind of see this. By the way, if any of this is unfamiliar to you, this stuff is It should hopefully be kind of common knowledge. If you're 3-betting a very different range than this, say you 3-bet all your best hands and call all your marginal hands, well, think about what that does to your calling range. Well, it makes your calling range very weak, which makes you very susceptible to a squeeze from someone yet to act, which is a problem, right? So in this scenario, we're 3-betting low ace-x suiteds, king-9 suited a lot, 10-9 suited, some low-suited connectors, king-queen offsuit now, 3-bets a lot. You're going to find as we get in later positions, they were on the button, now king-queen offsuit is going to be doing a lot of calling, and we're going to bump the 3-bets down to some weaker offsuit hands. And now notice here now ace-10 offsuit does a whole lot of 3-betting, right? Suited connectors do a whole lot of calling, but again, a lot of the bluffs in this spot are going to come from ace-x suited and king-x suited. And you're going to find that ace-x suiteds and king-x suiteds usually do a decent amount of 3-betting when you're in position. By the way, so far everything we've been discussing applies to when you're in position playing deep stacked. Your ranges are going to be a little bit different when you are playing shallower stacked, and also when you are out of position. We're going to talk about out of position later, and shallower stacked later. We're just getting warmed up. If you enjoy this show, if you enjoy me just getting warmed up, click the like and subscribe button. Enjoy some brain fuel. When are the ICM charts coming to Poker Coaching Premium? Soon. Be patient, everyone. We have a big release coming right around the time of Black Friday. We have an advanced tournament course coming out with all sorts of GTO ranges that are adjusted to take into account ICM and final table payouts. We also have heads-up charts, both with an ante and without. Well, with a small ante, like in an online tournament, and then with a big ante, a big blind ante, like in a live tournament. You're going to find that those strategies are very different. I've actually been going through a lot of those videos. Justin Saliba, who just won his second World Series bracelet, he played heads-up against Jonathan Jaffe, who is the heads-up master. He was one of the biggest winners for quite a while in online heads-up games, and they battled it out. They talked about it. They talked about the game with an ante and with a small ante, and it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot in it. What I learned is that they're both better at heads-up poker than I am. All right. When the young ones who watch and study the game grow up in a few years, how are they going to make money if the vast majority of them understand all of these things? We have to understand that if people all play well, you're not going to make a lot of money. That's why you have to find games that you can beat. You have to find games that you can beat and play them a lot. Also, a lot of people who find poker in their midlife times means they have not actually studied a lot, and they usually have way too much money for their own good. For example, if you make $200,000 a year and you decide to take up poker on the weekend, you start playing $1,000 buy-in tournaments because that's the amount of money it makes you, or that's the amount of money it takes to make you feel alive when you gamble. Well, you know, you're playing $1,000 games way out of your bankroll. But yeah, a lot of the players who start young, when they have no money, like I did when I started, I had $50. You're going to find that those players usually end up pretty good if they survive in the game for 5 or 10 years and they work hard and they study and they diligently work. Yeah, so if you don't game select and you only play against the best players in the world, yeah, you're not going to win. Hate to break it to you. Only 3 things you have to do to win: find a game you can beat, play it a lot, and keep a proper bankroll. Simple as that. Mixed games are the future. I don't think so. Mixed games have a few very big problems that makes them tough to be very profitable at. But again, find a game you can beat, play it a lot, keep a proper bankroll, right? Simple as that. I think, Lotto, what you're not realizing is that a lot of players will continue to get into poker because they want to gamble. Simple as that. They have not studied adequately. Very few people who are 40 years old, like me almost, who are playing poker today started when they were 18. Almost none. If you look around the poker table at 40-year-old people, the vast majority of them are not all that great at poker. Simple as that. If you look around at a lot of the vast majority of 30-year-old players who are playing poker, a lot of them aren't that good. Now, if you look at a lot of the 21-year-old players or 19-year-old players who have enough money to play $5,000 buy-in tournaments, yeah, they're pretty good. But that's because they've not had time in life to accumulate wealth, right? Typically, people accumulate wealth as they get older, and therefore they have more disposable income as they get older, and that usually results in the older players generally being worse than the younger players across the board because they've had plenty of time to gather wealth, which is why if you find a 70-year-old player at the poker table, they're usually somewhat wealthy, and they probably have not devoted their whole life to poker. Maybe they did, but probably not, right? Also, a lot of people don't want to study. Simple as that. Not a whole lot of people are here at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., whatever time it is, studying with me. All right, anyway, let's take a look at this. Button versus under the gun raise. You do a lot of calling, almost no 3-betting. Take a look here. You're 3-betting 5.5% of hands, which is almost nothing. You're 3-betting just purely the best hands, and then a smattering of bluffs. And you're calling with a lot. You're calling with a lot because you really don't want to be 3-betting against early position, or you don't want to be 3-betting a lot against early position players. All right, let's take a look now. What if the raise comes from later position? Let's say the low jack raises, and we are in the hijack seat. So this low jack is under the gun six-handed. This is going to be if you're playing a six-handed online tournament or six-handed live tournament, or if just the low jack player raises. Okay? So in this scenario, we're three betting now with a wider range for value. As your opponent's opening with a wider range, because they're raising from later position, you in turn get to three bet with a wider range. So notice here, we are now three betting with 7.4% of hands instead of 5.5% of hands, purely because our opponent's starting with a wider range, right? So as the opponent starts with a wider range, we in turn three bet with a wider range. We do a little bit less calling too. So essentially we're playing roughly the same range, but we're doing way more aggressive plays in scenarios like this in general. Here's like slightly different spots. But in this scenario, we are three betting a lot, calling some, even when we're in the hijack seat. If we move us over to the button though, we're gonna be doing a lot more calling. So now we call wider, three bet wider, call wider across the board because the opponent's range is wider, right? So as your opponent's range is wider, you in turn play wider in general. Now I want to point out here though, look at our actual value range. Look at the hands that are three betting with the idea that they are going to be getting it in. So that would be three bet versus four bet. It's still roughly the same range. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king. Okay, so we have aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king. These are the hands that are good enough to get it in. And that's it. These are really the only hands in most scenarios that you're thrilled to get it in with if your opponent's raising from middle or early position. And even then, like jacks is not loving it, right? So this is a scenario where you really don't get to three bet all that wide for value if your opponent's raising for early position when you are deep stacked. Now, as you get shallower stacked, you can get in substantially wider because you lose less when you happen to be up against aces or kings, right? But whenever you're 80 big blinds deep or 200 big blinds deep, you have to be very cautious with three betting too wide, especially if your opponent's going to be using good four bet sizes that cut off your implied odds with your hands like nines. As you get deeper and deeper, you typically use bigger sizes. So in this scenario, again, look where most of the bluffs come from. Again, a lot of ace X suited, a lot of king X suited. Now because we're three betting wider, button versus low jack, we are now three betting maybe some queen eight suited, still some suited connectors. But again, a smattering of these offsuit hands that are barely good enough to call. Okay? So this is a spot where you're still three betting some, but with a slightly different range than earlier, just a different distribution of those hands, right? So instead of three betting only a few ace X suited when we're early position against early position, now we're three betting more. We're three betting more across the board. You also need to want to talk about what happens if players study poker for 10 years. What if you get into poker today and you start studying hard for 10 years? Won't the game be tough in 10 years? Well, look, all games get tougher in time, but also everybody's not studying for 10 years. Almost nobody's studying for 10 years. Like I said, plenty of players started playing poker when I started playing poker. 19 years ago, whatever it's been. Most of them are broke because they did not study well, they did not play well, they did not apply themselves, etc. Now, the players who did start back when I started, yeah, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. Most players who survive 15, 10, whatever years are pretty good. Yes. Players today have better tools than they had back when I started. Therefore, they're going to get better quicker. Yes. But so many poker players don't do any of that stuff, which is why the game's going to remain good all the time, especially if you're playing games that it's not so clear who has an edge. As it becomes more and more clear who has an edge, the game typically dies off quickly. And fortunately, in poker tournaments and live cash games, it's not so clear who has an edge a lot of the time. Old timers crush young whippersnappers because they bluff too much. I'm actually pretty sure the young players beat the old players because the old players fold too much. Also, you got to realize, if you think the opponents are bluffing too much, the easy adjustment is to just stop bluffing, right? Once it becomes clear that you think an older player is going to overfold, you just bluff a ton. And once it becomes clear they're going to start trapping a lot, first off, you get to realize your equity well because they don't three bet you and they don't raise you off your hands very often. And also, you just stop bluffing. Right? I mean, life's easy if your opponent literally just always has a good hand. Just stop bluffing. Easy game, right? You got to realize, whenever you have this idea that my opponent does something really, really bad, therefore I'm going to hardcore counter exploit it, if your opponent's anywhere near competent, then they're just going to demolish you. Poker is super duper easy if you know what your opponent's going to do wrong. So if you tell me, if you announce with your strategy, or out loud, that you're going to call me down every time, well then, just value bet thinner. Bluff less often. Easy. Right? Okay. Any three betting advice for the main event in Rotterdam? Literally what I'm telling you right here. Literally this. Here we are. Also, check out the tournament masterclass at pokercoaching.com if you have not already. All right, let's take a look now. Button raise versus cutoff. Now this is where we're going to be pretty wide. So now we're 3-betting 12.5%, calling 16.4%. So we're 3-betting now wider for value because we're against the widest opening range that we're going to be against in the cutoff. Right here, button against cutoff. Cutoff's we're raising pretty wide. We in turn 3-bet a little bit wider. Notice versus 4-bet, we're now getting it in with hands like 10s, right? So 10s are 4-betting all in, or 4-betting all in, or sorry, 5-betting all in when we get 4-bet. We're still folding out the weaker hands to the 4-bets, like King Jack offsuit, Ace 10 offsuit, 9-7 suited, etc. But we are splashing pretty hard against a 4-bet, which I think a lot of people don't do. That said, a lot of people do not 4-bet often enough. Let's actually take a look at cutoff versus 3-bet from button. Notice that most people do not 3-bet anywhere near often enough. Most players are way too tight and way too passive in this scenario. So if you raise cutoff and your opponent 3-bets you on the button, you're supposed to be 4-betting King 5 suited basically every time. Ace 2 suited basically every time. King 9 suited basically every time. Notice Ace 9 offsuit, Ace 10 offsuit, King Jack offsuit, 3-betting frequently, half the time each, give or take. Right? Most players do not take a hand like Ace 10 offsuit or Ace 9 offsuit or King 5 suited or King 4 suited or Ace 2 suited and 4-bet it at a large frequency. They just don't do it. Which means when they do 4-bet you, they usually have more of this good strong value range plus perhaps a smattering of bluffs, a small smattering of bluffs. And in that scenario, that's going to result in you wanting to overfold against their 4-bets. So if we go back over here and put us on the button versus 4-bet from cutoff, you'll see now we would be a little bit tighter here. So we would not defend quite so wide, like King 8 suited, maybe King 9 suited. Probably still call a lot of suited connectors, call a lot of the pairs. 10-8 suited we fold. Maybe Ace Jack offsuit, maybe even King Queen offsuit we would fold if your opponent's not going to be 4-bet bluffing enough. Also, you may not want to get it in quite as wide either. The reason you can profitably get it in against 10s if your opponent's only getting it in with like 10s and better is because they're going to be folding out some of the time to your shove. If your opponent's going to fold out less often to your shove, you have way less fold equity with a hand like 10s, which means you don't realize the 4-bet that they put in with them folding. You don't realize fold equity in this scenario. Therefore, you can't shove quite as wide for value either. Okay, so you should be a little bit tighter. How much should we adjust to a live straddle / third blind? Well, it becomes a slightly different game. Really, it just kind of crushes the small blind to some extent. You also have to raise a little bit tighter in general because there's more players yet to act. So small blind gets demolished. Big blind gets hurt a lot. You have to be a little bit tighter across the board from the other positions. That's it. All right. Let's talk about now what happens when we're shallower stacked. Okay? Let's go back to under the gun versus... let's go to under the gun +1 versus under the gun. So this is where we're going to be the tightest. This is where they're going to be the tightest. Let's now, instead of having 80 big blinds, let's say we have 60 big blinds, okay? Let's take a look at these numbers. We're 3-betting 6.1%, calling 3.7, super duper tight range. If we make our stack shallower, we're still going to be super duper tight. Okay? It changes negligibly, right? We 3-bet a little bit less, call a little bit more, whatever. It's going to change negligibly because we're against earlier position. What if we're 40 big blinds? Roughly the same thing. 30 big blinds. Roughly the same thing. 25 big blinds. Roughly the same thing, but now a little bit tighter. We get a little bit tighter and tighter in these scenarios. We do start to see a tiny introduction of all ends for 25 big blinds against under the gun raise. 20 big blinds, we're going to start seeing a lot more all ends though. So as you get really shallow, like 20 big blinds, this is where we are going to start shoving a decent amount of the time before the flop. So now you see 20 big blinds, deep hands like Ace King jam every time. Jacks and 10s and 9s really like to shove. Ace Queen offsuit really likes to shove. King Queen suited, King Jack suited, Queen Jack suited like to shove. Essentially, all these hands have a lot of equity against your opponent's calling range, and they also have good blockers to your opponent's calling range. So you have a lot of fold equity, and they do pretty well when you get called. But if you instead call or 3-bet, and you completely miss the flop, you're going to be in a pretty rough scenario. You have to pay for these charts. Some of these charts are free at pokercoaching.com, and some of them are paid. Believe it or not, I am running a business. Fortunately, though, these charts are substantially cheaper than they are on basically every other training site. They want to charge you $500 a month just for charts, no training material, just charts. At Poker Coaching Premium, you get access to everything I've made and everything a lot of my other coaches have made, and you'll enjoy it. Check it out, pokercoaching.com/premium. All right, so in this scenario now, 20 big blinds CPC, we have a small 3-betting range with Ace King suited, which is very good, Kings, which is very good, Queens, which is very good, Ace 9 suited as a bluff, and a little bit of pocket aces. We do still have a calling range with a lot of hands that flop very well. What a lot of players do wrong in this scenario is that they call way too wide. They call with all pairs. They call with all suited connectors 20 big blinds deep, and that is a big mistake. Let's go back, though. I don't want to get too bogged down on 20 big blind play. Let's go back to 40 big blind play. I really want to compare this to 80 big blind strategy because this is important stuff. Let's say we are in the hijack seat versus under the gun playing 40 big blinds deep. I want to compare this to 80 big blinds deep. So notice now, still only 3-betting a very small range, 5.3%. And by the way, if you're 3-betting 5.3% in scenarios like this, you know it basically means aces, kings, queens, and ace-king for value, right? Plus a few other hands, maybe like jacks if you want to slot it in there. By the way, when you look at this chart and you see jacks 3-betting 41%, 10s 3-betting 42%, 9s 3-betting 43%, essentially you can take all of these and just put them in pocket jacks and pocket queens and call it a day. I realize that's not exactly GTO. You're losing a tiny bit of value compared to GTO. You'll have slightly worse board coverage on various flops, but it's going to be way easier to play. So you can also do the same thing for a hand like, ace-queen offsuit. Just put them all in the ace-king offsuit. Call ace-queen offsuit. Use ace-jack as your bluff. Call it a day, right? So it's going to be relatively close to this strategy with roughly the same value and 3-betting frequencies, but way, way, way easier to implement. I think you just 3-bet a smattering of bluffs here. By the way, all these charts are available on your phone in the poker coaching app. It's really easy to access them. My phone is completely closed. I'll get logged in real quick. Let's see. I'll show you how quick it takes to pull up the charts from complete scratch. What chart are we on? 40 big blinds. I'm already on the chart. Let's see. 40 big blinds. Hijack versus raise from under the gun +1. Or under the gun. There we go. Same chart, right? Right there on the phone. Pulled it up very quickly. And then, if you want to go to a different scenario, say instead we're in the, on the button. Opponent is under the gun +1, is whatever, so you can pull it up very quickly. You can reference these charts very, 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 very quickly and effectively. That way, you can look at the scenario you think you can be at next hand and plan accordingly. Now, some casinos don't allow this, some online sites don't allow this. Obviously, don't break the terms and conditions of your site. But if they let you, you're kind of foolish to not be referencing these charts if you do not have them perfectly memorized. And I'll tell all of you, very honestly, I don't have this spot perfectly memorized. Nobody has these spots perfectly memorized. Maybe some savants do. I'm not a savant. I'm just a regular guy. So I do my best to study. I know roughly what these charts are going to look like. But wouldn't it be better if you know specifically what they look like? For example, if I pulled up this chart right now, I probably just 3-bet the king-9 suited every time and the ace-8 suited every time and the ace-jack offsuit or the king-queen offsuit every time. Mix it up a little bit, Got to change it up every now and then. Maybe hands like king-10 suited we 3-bet every time, right? And obviously call the other hands in green and you're going to be pretty good. All right, let's take a look now at button. This is where we're going to be calling a lot, right? So here we are, 40 big blinds deep. Notice we call 16.6 40 big blinds deep. 80 big blinds deep, though, we get to call more. Why do we get to call more when we're deeper stacked? Well, when we're deeper stacked, we get to call more. We get to call the wider range because we're getting better implied odds, right? So as you are in better position, you get to call with wider and wider ranges. All right? You have to call with wider and wider ranges as your stack gets deeper. Let's look at 20 big blind strategy, button against under the gun raise. You see now we're only calling 11% with roughly the same 3-betting percentage. Not the same range at all, but the same percentage. So now notice under the gun versus button 20 big blinds deep, we're only getting to play, let's call it 17% of hands total. 40 big blinds deep, we get to play 21% of hands total. And 80 big blinds deep, we get to play 23% of hands total. Okay? Okay. Is there a certain guideline or percentage for your VPIP stats, realizing it will vary from session to session? I mean, yeah, if you're playing way wider than the charts, you're playing too many hands. Simple as that. If you're playing way fewer than these hands, you're playing too tightly. People keep asking for the volume turned up. The volume is turned up pretty high. Not sure why it would not be. I mean, it's maxed out on both settings. It actually lowered it automatically on the OBS program because I thought it was too loud. Maybe there's some problem. I don't know. Maybe there's a problem with the streaming program. You got second in one of PokerStars' largest tournaments. Good job, good work, Austin. Another one of my students won a $300 tournament in Maryland the other day for 20-something thousand bucks. Good job, good work, everyone. All right. Okay. So let's go back. Button versus under the gun raise, 40 big blinds deep. You see, we don't do a lot of 3-betting. As you're in earlier position, you 3-bet a little bit more often. Now, why do you 3-bet a little bit more often when you're in early position? Let's look at under the gun +1 against, I'm sorry, wrong chart. Let's look at under the gun +1 versus raise from under the gun. You see you actually 3-bet 5% of the time. So you're 3-betting 5% of the time against an under the gun +1 raise. But if you're on the button, you 3-bet 4.7%, a little bit less. Why are you 3-betting a little bit less when you're in position? Well, the answer is because now there are fewer players yet to act who can re-raise, right? Also, you can't re-raise and get it in all that wide against an under-the-gun range because their range is going to be super duper 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 strong. Okay? So you call wider in scenarios where you're going to get 3-bet less often. Okay? I mean, to take this to the extreme, look at what you do in the big blind against an under-the-gun raise. You call a ton. You call a ton. Why are you calling a ton? Because in this scenario, there's, first off, you're getting better pot odds because you're closing the action. Or if you're getting better pot odds because you're in the big blind and you're closing the action. So you call substantially wider, right? Not that that's what we're looking at right now. So anyway, button versus raise from under the gun, you don't do a whole lot of 3-betting, and you do a lot of calling with suited connectors, good strong high card hands, pairs, etc. You do not call with the offsuit hands. Notice all these junky offsuit hands fold. Ace-9 offsuit, 10-9 offsuit, Jack-10 offsuit. These are not playable hands. You should fold them. Is there a specific VPIP? Well, it depends on how many players are at the table. It depends on if there are payout implications. It depends on your stack depth, right? So Scott, no. There is a specific correct answer for your specific exact situation, but your specific exact situation is going to change frequently. Okay? All right, let's take a look at button versus raise from low jack seat. Now we're going to play wider and 3-bet more, right? So we're going to be playing wider and 3-betting more in general because our opponent's raising with a wider range to begin with. You'll notice in position we're always 3-betting kind of polarized, right? Notice we're always 3-betting to hands that are kind of near the bottom of the range, and we're 3-betting hands that are always good. So we basically 10s and better, ace king and ace queen suited. In this scenario, we're 3-bet bluffing with some offsuit hands. Not all of them, but some. And again, if you wanted to make this implementable, maybe you 3-bet every king 10 offsuit and every queen jack offsuit. Call ace 10, call king jack, call ace jack, call king queen, call ace queen. I think that's fine. Fine and reasonable. Again, you can make some implementable strategy with all these suited hands. Maybe you 3-bet king 9 suited, queen 9 suited, and jack 8 suited every time. I think that's probably fine. Something like that. All right. Let's take a look against cutoff raise. This is where we're going to be really wide. We're going to be 3-betting the most, and we're going to be calling the most. So now we're 3-betting 9% of hands against the cutoff, 40 big blinds deep. And let's just compare this to 80 big blinds. Well, first off, let's look at this chart real quick. Again, does this polarized strategy hold true? Answer is very clearly yes. We're 3-betting the hands that are not quite good enough to call, or hands that are at least on the bottom of our range. And again, if you wanted to make this implementable, maybe 3-bet ace 8, ace 9 offsuit, jack 10 offsuit, queen 10 offsuit every time. Call the rest of them. I think that's reasonable. Maybe 3-bet some king x suited, queen x suited, maybe like this 9-7 suited down here. That's also reasonable. Okay? Compare this, though, to the 80 big blind chart. 40 big blinds deep. Go ahead, like, use some logic in your head before I show you what the GTO strategy is. And think, what should I do differently 40 big blinds deep compared to 80 big blinds deep? And there's one, like, clearly obvious adjustment in my brain that I already know is going to happen. And then from there, you can extrapolate to other things. So, logically, you're going to have to get it all in with a stronger range, which means you're going to 3-bet with with fewer value hands. You're going to 3-bet with fewer value hands as you get deeper stacked. You're just going to. So maybe jacks and 10s, we're not going to 3-bet quite so often. If we're 3-betting less often, that means we have to 3-bet less often as a bluff. So what we're going to see is we're going to see the 3-betting percentage go down, I got to presume. Let's see. Oh, actually it went up. Ha ha, funny enough. We're bluffing more. That's the problem. Our value range, though, got tighter. Our value range got tighter. Value range got tighter. That's the important thing here. Notice 10s and 9s, 8s still do some, 7s, these hands don't re-raise quite as often. Oh, we're against cutoff. My bad. I was thinking we were against under the gun. Button against cutoff is different than button against under the gun. Oh, my brain's broken. Here we get to re-raise wider because we can call 4-bets more often. Deeper stacked. Okay? Let's take a look at 60. 60, notice we 3-bet less often. Isn't this neat? Look, at 60, we 3-bet less often. Oh, we are 3-betting. We are 3-betting less often across the board. Okay. Trying to read chat and getting distracted and trying to drink some drink, you know? Having a good time. Okay, let's take a look at what we do against a 4-bet 80 big blinds deep. Versus a 4-bet 80 big blinds deep, we do a lot of calling. This is why we get to 3-bet more, slightly more, right? And if we look at 40 big blinds deep, we have to fold. Oh, here we go. The problem is they're 4-betting all in. Once your opponent starts 4-betting all in, that's where you have to be tighter. Haha, caught bluffing, indeed. So notice here, whenever they shove all in, we have to be tighter calling it off, right? Or calling in general. So whenever you have to be tighter calling in general, you in turn don't get to re-raise as often as a bluff, right? Makes logical sense. But notice again, that whenever we are deeper, we have to be a little bit more cautious with our best hands. A little bit more cautious with our best hands as we are deeper stacked, because we don't really love getting it in this scenario, which is why we see we don't 3-bet these as often in this scenario. Button versus raise from cutoff. Clicking the wrong buttons up here. You all can't see them, but there's buttons at the top of the screen I'm clicking through. Trying to find the exact right spot. Always make sure you're using the chart for the scenario that you're in, obviously. So anyway, 80 big blinds deep, we use lots of these low hands, like ace-x suited and king-x suited, because we want to be able to continue against the re-raise. But we are more aggressive in general as we are deeper, because we can call 4-bets more often, and the 4-bets are not all in, right? The 4-bets are not all in when we are 80 big blinds deep. That's a very important thing. As the 4-bets become all in, or any bet becomes all in, you have to stop bluffing quite so often, especially with hands that flop well, because you're not going to get to see a flop whenever they rip it in on you, right? Some people are wondering, why are we 3-betting 8s instead of 9s and 7s, and why are we 3-betting 6s? GTO does some funny stuff based on your opponent's GTO strategy. It usually lines up with various blockers that your opponents have, or various hands they're using as bluffs or not as bluffs, etc., etc. I would not read too much into it, honestly. I think in this scenario, a lot of people get really bogged down with trying to memorize the charts. But don't memorize the charts. I'm telling you, you don't need to perfectly memorize the charts, because first off, you can't implement the charts, because nobody knows 3-bet your 9 6% of the time. I mean, figure that one out, right? In this exact spot, remember, this is just button versus cutoff, 80 big blinds deep. If we're 77 big blinds deep, it's going to be slightly different. If we're 82 big blinds deep, it's going to be slightly different. If the opponent raises the hijack, it's going to be really different, right? But whenever you see the solver doing something kind of funny, it usually has to do with your opponent's exact GTO strategy. This comes up sometimes when you're playing shallow stacked, where you'll see hands like maybe like queen 10 offsuit folds, but jack 10 offsuit calls against a short stacked all in some scenarios. Because of the way that your opponent's shoving range lines up, your queen X is more dominated than your jack X. That kind of thing happens sometimes. So anyway, I would not read too much into that. Okay, let's go down to shallow stacked play. So we saw in these scenarios how to play roughly deep stacked. Let's look at 20 big blind poker, because 20 big blind poker is important. This is how you're often playing in a tournament. Let's put us under the gun +1 versus under the gun raise. This is where now you have to be really careful 3-bet bluffing too often, because when you do face a re-raise, you're going to be all in very clearly, right? Like there is no room for small 4-bets, etc., etc. So under the gun +1 against under the gun, spot that doesn't come up very often, but in this scenario, you do still have a small 3-betting range, and you are 3-betting. We can go over here and look at versus 3-bet all in versus 4-bet all in from under the gun. You see, we're folding out the bottom portion of our range whenever we do 3-bet small and then get 4-bet. So they're going to make it 2. We're going to make it like 5. And then they jam on us, right? So in this scenario, we have to put in 15 to try to win 41 or 41 and a half. 42 and a half? 42 and a half. Again, brain's broken. It's early in the morning. I apologize, by the way. The show is live and not perfectly manicured. Not that I do more than one take on any of my other videos anyway. But early in the morning, my brain's halfway broken sometimes. Which is why you got to make sure that your brain's in good shape when you actually go to play poker. A lot of people think they can just roll out of bed and hop in poker and play great, or hop in the tournament and play great, but not necessarily true. You got to make sure you're warmed up a little bit. You know what? Looking at charts like this or going through poker hands, going through the quizzes at pokercoach.com is a great way to get warmed up. All right, so anyway, if we do 3-bet small with these hands, we have to get it all in. The question was, are we only all in or fold when somebody raises from under the gun? Well, what's the GTO chart say? By the way, here's what under the gun should be raising 8-handed. 8-handed here is what under the gun should be raising. 6 isn't better, ace-3 suited better, ace-10 offsuit and better. I think all that's logical. I think a lot of people, though, don't raise king-8 suited, queen-9 suited, jack-9 suited, 10-8 suited, so their range is going to be a little bit tighter. So if their range is a little bit tighter than this, also I think a lot of people don't raise queen-jack, king-10, ace-9, like ever. If their range is going to be a little bit tighter than this, you in turn have to be a little bit tighter yourself. But notice that's not like a lot tighter, right? I think most people in most games are going to use roughly this strategy. So, in the spot, this is what they raise under the gun +1, you use this strategy of 3-bet jamming, hands that are almost always good, but really vulnerable to being outdrawn, / will flop poorly sometimes. Jacks, 10s, 9s, ace, king, ace, queen, offsuits, king, queen, jack suiteds, right? But then we do have some 3-bet smalls. Notice when you do 3-bet small with the hands that are at the bottom portion of your range, ace, queen, offsuit, ace, jack, offsuit, and ace, 10 offsuit, and ace, 9 suited, you fold them when you get jammed. So they make it 2, you make it 5, they rip it in on you for 20, you're supposed to fold for 15 more into 42.5 total. A lot of people don't do that. They don't do that. Notice that this all-in range is 3.2% of hands, and the 3-bet small range is 2.3% of hands, like a real percentage of the hands that you're playing. You're calling 4% of hands here as well. Some people literally never call. They think in this spot, 20 big blinds deep, their only option is to go all in or fold. And to be fair, I thought that for a long time. You want to know why? Because we used bad tools. Long time ago, we did not have good poker tools. We didn't have Pio Solver and Munker Solver and all the ICM programs. We had none of that. We had programs that would tell you if you should go all in or fold. But obviously, your options are not all in or fold. Your options are call, 3-bet small, all in, or fold. You can even 3-bet big if you wanted, if you want to have another 3-bet size. I got to imagine Solver probably would not do that. Coffee does a better job than brain fuel. Actually, funny enough, I'm out of brain fuel and I have coffee today, and my brain's not working, so take that for what it's worth. I will say, I like brain fuel way more than I do like coffee, because it gets you going quickly and it sustains you way longer. Given I am completely out of brain fuel, I'm going to end up having like 4 cups of coffee today, as opposed to 0.75 brain fuels. All right. Anyway. Again, find stuff that works for you. It's important to find stuff that works for you. A lot of people think that what works for me must work for everyone. Not true. Some things work for some people, some things work for other people. It's important to make sure that you find things that work well for you and your situations, right? A lot of people get it in their heads that if I do it, it must be right. First off, if you do it, that doesn't mean anything. That just means you do it. But even if it is right for you, it doesn't mean it's right for everyone. Please understand that. All right. So anyway, let's see. By the way, they do not sponsor me. They paid me $0.0, so take that for what it's worth. I try to share things with you that I think might be helpful for you. All right. Let's take a look at now under the gun +1 versus raise from. Let's look at hijack versus raise from under the gun +1, or from under the gun. Yeah, here we go. Hijack versus raise from under the gun, playing 20 big blinds deep. Now, logically, our shoving range is going to be wider, right? Our shoving range is going to be wider because we are in later position. In general, there are fewer people yet to act who will randomly wake up with a hand. When you are shallow stacked, you have to be concerned when you're ripping it all in that there are some number of players yet to act who will wake up with a hand and just bust you, which is terrible, right? So you have to shove way tighter when you are in early position compared to when you are in later position. So in later position, you get to shove a little bit wider. You will find in GTO world, the hands that shove are going to be the hands that are likely good, have good blockers, but are going to be very vulnerable, right? Or hands that are just not going to flop all that well. And you're going to find that ace-king offsuit almost always falls in that scenario, as does ace-queen offsuit. Ace-king offsuit, ace-queen offsuit, and then hands like jacks and 10s almost always fall into the shoving strategy, okay? Also, you'll find these suited connected type hands, the best suited connected type hands, like king, queen, king, jack, and queen, jack suited almost always fall in the shoving category as well. I mean, you can click through here and you can see, right? Let's take a look. Those hands almost always fall in this category. And obviously the categories get wider and wider as you get in later positions, right? So as you get in later positions, you'll find this shoving range for the suited connected type hands kind of gets bumped down just a little bit. So we see now king, queen suited calls a lot, right? Still shove some. But ace, king, ace, queen, queens, and jacks and 10s almost always do a lot of shoving. All right, let's go back to hijack, though. Hijack versus raise from under the gun. What I want to point out here, notice aces, kings, and queens, slow play, some portion of the time each. right? Notice aces calls 69% of the time. Kings calls 45, queens call 52. Again, these numbers don't have to be exact. If I was to perhaps try to make this up in GTO world, what I would do, an implementable world, what I would do is I would call aces every time, call kings every time, 3-bet small queens every time. Again, not perfectly implementable, but I think it's reasonable. Also notice here, remember I said in the other scenario it was like 3.2% shove, 2.3% 3-bet. So like they're both real percentages, real portions of your playable range. Here, we don't actually have a whole lot of small 3-bets. We have some. It does make up like 15% of or 12% of our playable range, which would be 6.5 plus 1.5 plus 4.2, 1.5 divided by that, whatever that number is. Call it 12%. So in this scenario, I don't think it's mandatory for you to have a small 3-betting range. I really don't. I think I would in game, like because I'm trying to play good, strong world-class poker. But if you look at a chart like this and your 3-bet small range is starting to become a really small number, maybe you just call aces, kings. Maybe you shove queens. Don't have a small 3-betting range at all. And I think that's fine. I think it's reasonable. Still, though, lots of calls. A lot of people don't call in this scenario 20 big blinds deep. Let's now look at when you're on the button. Now you're going to call more, right? And notice now the small 3-bet range is basically none. So now I would just not have a small 3-bet range. It's 5.4 combinations of hands, which is almost nothing. Some kings, some queens, some nines, and a few nonsense hands. So I would just not have a small re-raising range now. And you're going to find that as you get in later and later position, you 3-bet small less often. One big benefit of 3-betting small, by the way, is that you don't get stacked whenever somebody cold 4-bets you, whenever they happen to wake up with the nuts, right? It's like in this scenario. Say you're in the low jack seat against under the gun and you 3-bet small with like ace-9 suited, or ace-10 offsuit or ace-jack offsuit, whereas maybe the other option would be to shove, which, I don't necessarily think it is, but let's say that was the option here. If you shoved ace-9 suited and ran into aces or kings or ace-king or whatever, you're just done, right? And there's a lot of players you attack. We have hijack, low jack, hijack, cutoff, button, small blind, big blind, and the initial raiser. All of them can wake up with a hand. So that's one other benefit of 3-betting small when you're in earlier positions. You're going to find, though, when we're on the button, we do a lot of shoving. Again, same pattern holds true. Ace, king, ace, queen, middle pairs, good suited, high card hands, maybe some ace-x suited as we get a little bit, later, a little bit of later positions. It seems like a lot of players only 3-bet small with aces in low stakes. Well, yeah, Tex, you got to realize a lot of players are terrible. They are really, 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 really bad. If your opponent's small re-raising range is only pocket aces, your strategy becomes super duper easy. Okay? Super duper 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 easy to play when your opponent has only aces. You just fold a lot. Easy game. Notice, though, GTO strategy on the button versus a raise from under the gun is to call aces every time and to call kings almost every time. And a big benefit of calling with aces and kings is that you now get to call slightly wider, because now players get to act, cannot shove you all in, thinking, oh, he has nothing, I can just shove and steal that 2 big blinds. And also, the initial raiser can't just like blindly barrel it off post flop, thinking you have a lot of marginal stuff, right? Because you just have aces and kings in your range. How much is a small 3-bet? So the initial raise here is 2 big blinds, playing 20 big blinds deep. If you're raising bigger than that, you're probably making an error. As you get really shallow, you just don't need to go all that big. And the 3-bet, I think, in this scenario is to 5 big blinds. So 3, so they make it 2, you make it 5. Something like that. Obviously, if we're at a final table, as Louis Philippe wants to talk about, you're going to be using different ranges to 3-bet. You're going to find that the small and medium pairs go way down in value. These hands become way worse. Suited connectors become way worse. Ace-X suited and King-X suited, though, become the hands that you want to be applying aggression with. Let's just take a look at small blind strategy, 20 big blinds deep against under the gun. You see lots of shoves from just the best hands. From the small blind, you're usually going to be shoving pretty linearly, meaning you're just shoving the best hands and calling the medium strength hands. Now, the big blind's not going to shove quite as often because they have to... Well, first off, they're getting good odds to close the action, right? And they, of course, have to worry about the initial raiser under the gun. And from the big blind, if under the gun raises, you're again just going to be shoving pretty strong hands, right? So we see queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, 8s, ace, king, ace, queen, ace, king, ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited. 5s and 4s, but still a lot of calls. By the way, 20 big blinds deep, whenever somebody raises and you're in the big blind, you got to do a lot of calling. And the reason you have to do a lot of calling is because you're going to realize your equity very, very well. When you're in the big blind against the minimum raise, you have to put in 1 to try to win 5.5 total. You don't have to realize all that much equity to make money in that scenario. Now, again, if there are payout implications in a tournament, or if you think your opponent's under the gun raise is maybe tighter than GTO, as I showed earlier, then you should defend a little bit less. But the hands you're going to defend less are just going to be the junky offsuit hands. The junky offsuit hands are the hands that get folded when you're in the big blind. Maybe like these low King X, low Queen X. I think those can be folded. Maybe like 7-5, 6-4, 5-3 offsuit could be folded. But you can't go around folding suited hands in the big blind against a 20 big blind raise. You just can't do it. Why does the solver hate sixes? It doesn't hate sixes, it just opts to call sixes. Again, has to do with the blockers, etc., etc. Okay, this was all against under the gun. What if we are in hijack versus a raise from the low jack? Again, low jack is under the gun six-handed. You still see we call aces and kings almost every time. Aces and kings love to slow play 20 big blinds deep. Remember, when we're playing deeper stacked, they basically always 3-bet. And whenever we are shallower, they almost always call. Okay? Notice if we were 30 big blinds deep, though, just a slightly different scenario. Now we have no all-ins in this scenario, and we now 3-bet the aces way more often. If we're 80 big blinds deep, again, we 3-bet aces every time, right? So 80 big blinds deep, we 3-bet every time. 40 big blinds deep, we're going to still 3-bet every time. 30, we're going to start calling some. 25, we're going to call a little bit more. 20, we're going to call every time with aces. We see a similar movement with kings. Notice also, when we are in the hijack versus a low jack raise, we lose all of our small 3-bets. Small 3-bets go away. This is typically where this starts to happen. Hijack against low jack, 20 big blinds deep. We stop having small 3-bet range in general. Let's look at hijack against under the gun. Hijack against under the gun, we still have small 3-bets. We have small 3-bets against under the gun because we don't want to get stacked with our junkier bluffs whenever we do happen to run into a good hand. Against under the gun +1, we'll have fewer small 3-bets, almost none, right? And against low jack, we'll have basically nothing. And that's going to be the case in these scenarios. In these scenarios, we are going to now start folding out, or we're going to start shoving or calling. We're not going to have a small 3-bet range anymore. Okay? So hijack versus low jack. Let's now go cutoff versus low jack. We're going to shove a little bit wider. Actually, we're shoving roughly the same range. That's interesting. Why are we shoving roughly the same range? Are we calling more? Yeah, we're calling a lot more, shoving the same. So shoving the same, calling a little bit wider. Let's see about against button. Against button, we do start shoving a little bit more. It's probably negligible difference. And we call more. So again, this is where we can be the widest is when we're on the button. You see, though, these medium-ish strength hands are the ones that opt to shove. Louis Philippe wants me to point out the small pairs don't get to call. Yeah, small pairs don't get to call in these scenarios. Small pairs are pretty bad. Small pairs are tough just because you don't get to continue on all that many flops. Like when you have a hand like pocket sixes and you call and see the flop, you're going to flop a straight draw sometimes that sometimes has an overcard. You know, like you're going to flop something. Whereas with a hand like 2s and 3s, you just don't flop anything unless you flop a set. And it's kind of hard to flop a set. Also, you don't get paid off all that much whenever you flop a set. But notice here, when we are shallow stacked and we're shoving it all in, take a look at this range that's 3-betting. Just sear this into your mind, okay? It's all the medium strength hands that are good, but not the super nuts, right? It's really just like a pretty strong linear-ish range of hands that are pretty good. Compare this, though, to a 40 big blind deep strategy that you're going to be 3-betting. Button versus low jack. Now, all those hands that were just shoving, not all, but a lot of them are now calling, right? So you see that now we're 3-betting very polarized. So when you're 3-betting non-all-in, you're usually 3-betting polarized with your best hands and then some hands that are good, you know, but not all-in type hands, or hands that you want to get all the money in with, which is usually going to be some ace-x suited, some king-x suited, some junky suited connectors, and then some junky offsuit hands. Okay, so again, just take a look at this chart. This chart here, 40 big blinds deep, button versus low jack raise, best hands, and some smattering of bluffs. 20 big blinds deep, though, we're now slow playing the aces and kings and just shoving hands that are pretty good, calling all the hands that are that perhaps used to have been potential 3-bet bluffs, right? This is going to hold true as well against cutoff. So you see a lot of these good hands are just shoving. We're shoving a roughly linear range minus aces, kings, and queens. But if we were 40 big blinds deep, a lot of these hands would instead be calling. Okay? A very, very important adjustment that I think a lot of people don't necessarily make. Also notice aces and kings slow plays a lot when you start to get shallow. What do you do if you have 10 big blinds only? Well, first off, button's not going to be raising very often. Button's going to be open jamming if everybody has 10 big blinds. But yes, realize these charts presume everybody has the same amount of chips, which they don't in the real world. But if your opponent is shoving, or opponent's raising with, like, let's say 40 big blinds and you have 10 big blinds, just get in with your good hands, right? Also, you're going to have a lot of spots where when you're 10 big blinds deep, you can just open rip it all in, right? By the way, whenever you're 10 big blinds deep, you don't only shove or fold, especially from early positions. Notice whenever you're 10 big blinds deep under the gun, aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king suited, min raise, as do the junkier hands. And then if you get shoved on by somebody yet to act, you're actually going to fold out the junkier hands. Let's take a look. Under the gun versus 3-bet all in from under the gun +1. You're going to fold out the bottom portion of your range. You're supposed to put in 2 big blinds out of your 10 and then fold king, jack offsuit, ace 9 offsuit, ace 7 suited, etc. What about against button? You have to call a little bit wider, but not much. And that's just because their shoving range has to be really good because your range is very well protected, right? Anyway, under the gun, raise first in range does have some min raises in it. Under the gun +1, it's going to be fewer min raises, more shoves, right? So now we see just some of the best hands raise plus a few of these high card blocker bluffs. By the way, your bluffs are going to come from the high cards as you get shallower and shallower, whereas they come from more suited connected hands as you get deeper and deeper, because when you're shallower, you want to block your opponent's shoving range, which means you want to have an ace or a king in your hand a lot of the time, because that's going to make it harder for them to shove on you. We go over here to the cutoff. You see cutoff 10 big blinds deep, almost no min raises now, right? Only aces and a smattering of bluffs. From the button, we're going to have actually, we do start having min raises, which is kind of neat. Why would we do this from the button? I guess exactly because we're in position. A lot of people use shove or fold only strategy. You may ask, by the way, why are we having a min raising range this shallow? Why not just shove or fold? And the reason is because whenever we shove or fold, we have to play a tighter range. Essentially, all these hands that are on the bottom of playability are hands that you could not profitably shove. But by using a min raise strategy, you get to min raise and fold out these hands profitably, and you get to get more value from your aces, kings, queens, and jacks. So essentially, you don't shove the best hands to allow you to raise some of the slightly junkier hands. Obviously, from small blind, you're going to have a bunch of calls, right? We're not talking about small blind strategy today. We've done that plenty of time, of the time. What if half the table has 20 and half the table has 40? Well, your stack is the most important, assuming a shallower stack has not already entered the pot. But yeah, things get convoluted whenever you are in a scenario where, let's say, you have 40 big blinds, 3 players to your left have 40 big blinds, the initial raiser has 20 to your right, right? So you have to not 3-bet all in nearly as often because you have 2 or 3 players to your left with 40 big blinds. So you have to use a little bit of logic. Got to use a little bit of logic, right? These charts, again, like I said, are not meant to be perfectly memorized. These are meant to be rough guides that you can then extrapolate from. You have to use a little bit of logic and learn to extrapolate. How do you play against limpers? Can you look at the title of the talk today? Where did it go? How to master 3-betting. If there are limpers, though, say it does go limp, 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 and then somebody raises. Well, you're going to want to raise a little bit larger because there's more money in the pot. Also, you have to ask, how tricky are the limpers? Some players are total fish who raise limpers every time. If you raise limps every time, you're a fish. Why? Because some limpers are tricky. It's important to realize that if the limper's going to limp with the nuts sometimes, you can't go around raising them with all sorts of garbage. It is so tilting to me. Whenever like say you're playing 30 big blinds deep and it goes limp, 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 you have a suited connected hand or even like a pair, like a hand that clearly wants to see the flop. You limp, and then a loose aggressive idiot behind you raises because they think, oh, limpers are weak, I raise every time. Then obviously under the gun shoves because they only are limping with the nuts, which is why you didn't raise with your pocket nines, or your king queen suited, you just limped because you want to see the flop. And then of course you have to fold your pocket nines because the under gun has aces, and then the initial the raiser also folds. Very tilting because they've not studied poker at all. But if the initial limper is clearly very weak, well then obviously you should be playing very differently. So you have to realize that the question is not how do you play against limpers. The question is how do you play against your specific limpers. Okay? You have to play against your specific opponents, not generic opponents. Now, of course, you could just load up a GTO chart for that scenario, but you got to realize the GTO chart will not presume your opponents went limp, limp, limp. Because if they went limp, 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 they're probably bad to begin with, which means you should probably be kind of far off from the GTO chart, right? You got to realize these charts presume your opponents play decently well. If your opponents don't play decently well, you have to make the logical adjustments. And as they get really far from the charts, then the charts are not necessarily going to apply. Like, let's say it goes raise, call, 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 minimum re-raise, call, call, minimum re-raise. And now it's on to you in the big blind. Well, sorry, I don't have a chart for that, right? And if it goes limp, 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 raise to 3 big blinds, which should like never happen. And then you're in the big blind. Sorry, I don't have a chart for that. You're going to have to figure that one out for yourself. But if your opponents are going to be making blunders left and right, then great, you're just going to win all the money because they're terrible. It's not hard to play against players who play in a terrible manner, especially if you can kind of predict what they're doing poorly, right? So you have to use some logic and figure it out yourself. Okay, that's me for today. I have a poker coaching webinar starting in 5 minutes. I should probably figure out what I'm talking about. Is my brain warmed up yet? Or finally awake and kicking? We will see. Hope you enjoyed the show today. If you want to test yourself further pertaining to 3-betting strategies, check out pokercoaching.com/3bet. We also have completely free access to pokercoaching.com coming up in a few days. Go to pokercoaching.com/free access. Does that sound right? I think that's right. I'm guessing here. Let's see. Please be right. Nope, not right. Sorry. I don't know what the website is. We'll be posting about it on Twitter. We'll have completely free access to Poker Coaching Premium for all of you who want to get in there, play around with these charts, screenshot them all, do whatever you want. That said, it's probably easier just to pay us a little bit of money and have complete full access to them all the time. But that will be happening very, very soon. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Make the most of your opportunities. I hope you study a lot and work a lot and make the most of this week. If you enjoyed the show, click the like and subscribe buttons below. Tell one of your friends. And that'll be that. Scott got 10 out of 10, but you did have to guess on one. Well, you know, at the end of the day, poker is a guessing game. If you guess closer to GTO than your opponents, you're probably going to win. That said, a lot of people aren't very good at guessing. Sometimes you have to guess, though. Sometimes you don't know. And you know, the nice thing is that when you don't know the answer, all of your years of study will kind of lead you towards the right answer. And you know you're not going to get it right all the time, but if you study way more than your opponents, you're going to get the right answer more often than people who have not studied at all, right? So if you know you guess in the random spots where you don't know correctly 62% of the time, and your opponents guess right 52% of the time, well, that's just equity going your direction. And that's a gigantic benefit of just looking at charts like this, searing them into your brain, and realizing this is what I need to be doing in spots kind of like this. And sure, you're not going to get it right all the time, but you're going to be closer than your opponents. If you're closer to the right answer than your opponents, the money's going to flow your direction. Good luck. Have fun. If you're a poker coaching member, I'll see you in the homework webinar starting in 3 minutes. If not,